I'm Daniel Drezner, Blogging Heads TV, and with me is Ed Kilgore. Hi, Ed.
Hi, Dan.
How are you doing?
I'm Ed Kilgore. I'm managing editor of The Democratic Strategist and a longtime blogger. I'm glad to be here with Dan.
Glad to be here with Ed. Ed, you just started a slightly different blog. Is this correct?
Well, it's an existing online magazine called The Democratic Strategist. The editors are Stan Greenberg, Bill Galston, and Rudy Teixeira. But among other things, I'm doing daily blogging there. So, yeah.
Okay.
So people that used to read my old blog, New Donkey, might want to give it a look.
Congratulations.
Thanks. Well, it's been an interesting week in Washington, D.C. As a lot of you probably know, the Senate had what's being called a sleepover the other night, an all-night debate engineered by Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid to debate the Iraq War, specifically a Democratic amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill that would set a timeline for withdrawal of combat troops. After the all-night debate, which also featured candlelight vigils and so forth,
were there any sleeping bags at this thing?
Oh, yeah, sleeping bags, cots,
okay.
Your tax dollars at work. What's interesting to me is that there were a fair number of people who did live blogging at the event.
Oh.
Which was presumably on C-SPAN. I have to admit, being an old guy and all, I actually slept during the night, didn't stay up. But, there are really kind of varying assessments of how effective that sort of tactic is. Reid was clearly trying to dramatize that Republicans were obstructing debate on the Iraq War, and it did culminate in a cloture vote to consider the Democratic amendment. And because all but 4 Republicans opposed it, and it takes 60 votes to invoke cloture, it failed. Mm-hmm. Clearly what's behind a lot of this is concerns among Democratic members of both houses of Congress that Congress's approval ratings are actually lower than Bush's.
Yeah.
Which, to use a Southernism, is lower than a snake's belly in a wagon rut. So what's interesting about that is that, it's really a little unclear why Congress's approval ratings are so low. Some anti-war Democrats are convinced it's because Democrats haven't stopped the war. Other Democrats think it's because they're talking about Iraq too much. My personal opinion is that they kind of raised expectations a little too high coming out of the last election that they were going to get a lot done. Mm-hmm. And with 60 votes necessary to conduct any kind of serious business in the Senate, it just wasn't going to happen. But in any event, I am told that the sleepover was part of a longer-range strategy by Reid that will involve accepting in a House-Senate conference basically the same Democratic amendment that failed in the Senate, which passed in the House, reattaching it to the Defense Authorization Bill and making the Republicans filibuster it again, and then being able to accuse Republicans in the fall, when more people are paying attention, of threatening basic funding for the U.S. Department of Defense as part of their efforts to defend Bush. The other thing that's going on is that Reid very clearly doesn't want to give Republicans an opportunity to posture as separating themselves from Bush on Iraq without voting for a bill that would actually have some binding effect on Iraq strategy. There are a couple of so-called bipartisan amendments kicking around.
Isn't there one that there's one that Lamar Alexander is pushing about basically adhering to whatever the Iraq Study Group proposed, correct?
Yeah, but the problem with that approach is that it's absolutely hortatory. It has no binding effect on the administration. If we learn anything about George W. Bush in Iraq over these many years, it's that he's going to do what he's going to do.
Yeah.
So nothing short of a deauthorization of the war or a funding cutoff is likely to bring him to heel. And all this, by the way, is timed to coincide with the long-awaited report by General Petraeus in September about how well the surge is working out.
Right.
And, there is some thought in Washington that Bush might bend to the inevitable if it's impossible for Petraeus to paint a positive picture of Iraq at that point. So on one level, the sleepover was just kind of, congressional kabuki theater. On another level, it was part of a pretty serious struggle that's been going on in both parties all year to sort of gain the initiative on Iraq policy and wrest some control away from Bush if it's constitutionally possible. So, kind of a silly scene, but a very serious intent. What I don't know is how many people in the country popped to NoDoz and watched the whole show. Probably not that many.
I would say probably not that many. I mean, speaking for myself, I did not watch it in part because you knew what was going to happen before it started, which was they weren't going to collect the votes from the Republicans, and so in the end it was mostly, as you said, kabuki theater. I do think there's an interesting issue, though, in the longer term, which is there's, 6 senators now running for president, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. One does wonder, because as you point out, there's 2 things going on here. The first is the debate about Iraq and whether or not, is there any way to influence President Bush's policy on this. But the second and larger issue is the relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch on things like going to war. And I've got to think that those 6 have mixed feelings about this, because as congressmen, obviously, they want to exercise more leverage now, and there's also more short-term political gain for taking the initiative. But I guarantee you, if any of them actually become president, I think the last thing they want is the idea of a Congress, emboldened by what it did in the last 2 years of George W. Bush's term, then exacting even more constraints on the president's foreign policy starting in 2009. Yeah,
I'm sure you're right, though most of these folks right now are so focused on winning the presidency that they, I'm not so sure they're that focused on preserving their options once they're elected. However,
although that's not entirely true.
Senator Clinton has actually pretty vocally suggested on occasion that she's a little more reticent than some of her colleagues to, restrict executive authority in foreign policy and national security because she's been in the White House for 8 years.
Right, exactly.
And,
I was going to say.
Obviously, there were quite a few efforts by Republicans in the 1990s, particularly in the context of the Kosovo conflict, to sort of tie Bill Clinton's hands. Mm-hmm. Having said all that, though, I do think it's kind of important to note that whatever differences among Democrats on executive authority and national security are pretty mild as contrasted to the view that George Bush has endorsed and that no significant Republican has challenged at this point, which is that the president's inherent constitutional powers as commander-in-chief essentially trump not only congressional authority, but actually U.S. and international law. That's a pretty radical point of view, and I don't know any Democrats that have come close to embracing that.
True, although I'm not sure as many Republicans embraced it as you think. I mean, frankly, this hasn't been a huge issue, among the presidential candidates, but I'm somewhat biased here because I've read a book that's going to come out in the fall by someone who worked in the Justice Department on this very issue, and it's very clear that legally, and one of the points he makes is that legally, even within the administration, basically the view that you just articulated is pretty much only held by the office of the vice president.
Well, that's a pretty big office.
Yeah. I grant you that.
A lot of people refer to this as the divine right of kings, theory of presidential authority. Mm-hmm. It'd be kind of fun if in one of the Republican presidential debates they were asked rather directly about this. It may sound like a highly technical issue, but frankly, this was the view of executive authority that was embraced by Richard Nixon, too, and we saw where that got us.
Yeah. No, this is a disturbing, it is a disturbing question for those who care about separation of powers, as well as the relationship of the United States to international treaties. This also brings up, as I said, the Office of the Vice President. There was a disturbing article in The Guardian earlier this week. I can't comment on the veracity of it, but it suggested that basically Cheney, who had been generally perceived as waning in influence over the last few years as Iraq has gone south, has basically managed to convince President Bush that he can't leave Iran to his successors. That Iran in the current status quo is such a bad case that you can't trust either the Republican or the Democrat who are running for president in 2008 to handle this issue. Therefore, Cheney is urging Bush to somehow solve this problem by 2000 before he leaves office. This prompted me to write a open letter to the president begging him not to pay attention to Iran, precisely because there is no circumstance under which I can see the Cheney solution to this. And the Cheney solution to Iran basically, I think, ranges from targeted bombing of nuclear facilities to all-out ground assault on Iran. in no way does any of this end well for the United States. This is not to diminish or belittle the threat that Iran poses to some extent, particularly regionally. In fact, Nick Kristof had a very amusing column this morning pointing out that in many ways Cheney and Ahmadinejad have a lot of similarities. They're both the second most powerful person in their countries, and they sort of feed off each other's radicalism. But, you know, and I've heard this from other sources as well, saying basically that the administration is just obsessed about Iran. You know, they really want to address this problem beforehand, and I just can't see how bombing is going to solve anything.
Well, there's nothing much more dangerous than an embattled president about to leave office who's still obsessed with doing something dramatic to improve his legacy. I can understand why George W. Bush would not want to make Iraq his major legacy, or the federal budget, or any number of other topics where he's screwed up royally. You know, and like most presidents, he probably is concerned about his place in history. But
I think it's more than that. I think he's obsessed with his place in history. That's what he keeps talking about. It's all about the legacy of history. You know, he doesn't care what happens now. He cares about how he's going to be viewed in 2030.
Well, I do know this, that, you know, for all the differences of opinion among Democrats on Iraq, which I think have been exaggerated in recent months, frankly, I think they have a pretty strong united front against any sort of belligerent action against Iran unless it's very directly provoked. I think you would see the kind of effort on funding or authorization with respect to Iran that you haven't seen with Iraq very, very, very rapidly. And a lot of Democratic senators have been warning the administration not to yield to this particular temptation. You know, I guess the other factor here is that with respect to Iran, it's kind of you certainly can't move against Iran in an aggressive way without some sort of understanding with other actors in the region, most notably Israel. I mean, my simple litmus test on Iran is this: if the Israelis think it's a threat that's containable, why should we think otherwise?
Well, actually, the suggestion in the Guardian piece was that, in fact, it was Israel that was part of the reason why Cheney is moving towards action, because I think what they're concerned about is that Israel will act first. And that if Israel acts and tries to punish Iran, the U.S. is going to get blamed anyway, which is at least in the region. So, in part,
well,
I think
it's very, I mean, you know, it's very unlikely that Israel is going to move against Iran without U.S. consent. I mean, it's not as though the two countries don't talk to each other all the time.
No, although, you know, when it comes to Iran, I'm not entirely sure how much the U.S. can constrain Israel. I mean, this administration has actually had a mixed record on constraining Israel. You know, on the one hand, they were able to scotch Olmert from talking to the Syrian leader, but on the other hand, you know, Bush has had almost no influence whatsoever on Israel's policy towards the occupied territories.
Yeah. Well, in any event, it seems pretty clear to me, and actually you've been talking about this earlier, that certainly people around Cheney and probably Cheney himself want to act on Iran anyway.
Yeah.
That provides an indirect encouragement to Israel to take steps that they otherwise might not want to take. So I don't think that absolves Cheney or Bush of any responsibility for what happens next.
Oh, no, of course not.
But I do think you would see a public reaction in this country, not just among Democrats, but among Republicans, independents, everybody, a very angry reaction to any direct belligerent action towards Iran. I think you would see, despite the lateness of the day, a serious effort towards impeachment of Cheney and Bush if they were to launch a preemptive war against Iran, or even support a preemptive war against Iran launched by Israel. I think that would be the straw that broke the camel's back.
I'm mostly agreeing with you. I mean, there's an argument in political science called the rally around the flag effect that says if you go to war, there's automatically this rush, upwards rush of support for political leaders. I actually think an attack on Iran would be an interesting test of that, because you're right. A president hovering around 30% approval ratings on the whole, is not necessarily going to get a big bump in popularity from engaging in an attack on Iran. Of course, it also depends on what we're talking about. And if we're talking about, a single missile strike, that's one thing as opposed to, some kind of sustained bombardment. And also, I think it really does depend upon the debate running up to it. In other words, do they start? Do you start seeing a more, Bush actually trying to make the case publicly, or do you see just, boom, without warning, an attack takes place? I tend to agree. There is a set of scenarios where I agree with you that if the U.S. were to launch a strike without any kind of public debate in this country whatsoever, I actually think you'd start seeing a bipartisan move against the president to constrain his powers. There is a flip side to this, though, in terms of foreign policy, and it's something that does mildly bother me. And again, I don't think the administration should attack Iran, if for no other reason that, all the intelligence estimates suggest that this is not an issue. Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon or having the capability to actually make a nuclear weapon is not going to take place for at least 5 years. There is a problem with the flip side, though, which is if you try to pursue this very cautious, foreign policy approach, as pointed out, there are people, in Iran that have an incentive, that have a vested political incentive to antagonize the United States. Ahmadinejad's popularity within Iran is actually not terribly high right now. The economy there is going slowly down the toilet. He's got problems from sort of more traditional-minded clerics. He has an incentive to sort of antagonize the West. And there's an argument that earlier in the spring, this is one of the reasons why the British soldiers, for example, the sailors, were seized in Iran. And similarly, why a whole bunch of Western academics were seized. It's a way to provoke conflict. Which raises a disturbing question, which is, if our policy is to be not to antagonize Iran, doesn't that give Ahmadinejad basically free rein to antagonize us willy-nilly?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. Obviously, in Iran, baiting the great Satan is going to create a short-term positive reaction for whoever does it. But those sort of wars of words have been going on for decades with Iran and with other countries, and I think that is attainable as long as both sides understand what's going on. But totally aside from whether Dick Cheney is whispering in George Bush's ear that we need another preemptive war to salvage his reputation from the disastrous preemptive war they actually are waging, this is going to be an issue for the next administration, too. And I find it kind of striking that in the Republican presidential candidate debates up until now, the basic disagreement is between those who want to attack Iran sooner rather than later. Whereas among Democrats, the only real difference of opinion is whether or not and exactly how you completely take use of force off the table in a containment strategy towards Iran. So there's a pretty stark difference between the two parties going forward. Assuming George Bush can restrain himself on Iran between now and the time he finally goes back to Crawford.
Ed, I'm going to rely on your because you've actually watched the debates, whereas I've been personally boycotting them all because it's just too goddamn early.
Well, it's not a pleasant task, but I watch most of them.
But to be fair,
there's another one coming out Monday.
Great. On the GOP side, I assume McCain has been the biggest booster of waging an aggressive posture against Iran, and he's obviously sinking like a stone. So, are there other Republicans really talking that aggressively towards Iran?
Yeah. Absolutely all of them except Ron Paul. It's sort of like the torture issue, which has also come up a lot in the Republican presidential debates. In a campaign where becoming the champion of the conservative GOP base is, as it often is, the great prize for candidates. They really have been competing with each other to appear as aggressive as possible towards Iran, and frankly as irresponsible as possible towards violations of domestic and international law when it comes to treatment of terrorist suspects or prisoners. A friend of mine, Will Marshall of the Progressive Policy Institute, likes to say that Republicans have always tried to be the daddy party. Now it's almost like they're trying to become the abusive daddy party, with expressions of almost authoritarian bent being sort of the coin of the realm in the Republican presidential debates, and with expressions of support for the Iraq War and of hostile intent towards Iran being a real litmus test that they seem to think the conservative base is demanding.
So I have to wonder how much of a misread this is, because, I mean, there's no question that there's about a third of the country that still, in some way or another, strongly supports President Bush. And presumably that's the cluster of voters that many of the GOP are going after. But that said, I can't help but wonder that even if those people exist, I'm not sure how politically active they're going to be this time around in 2008. It's not to say they wouldn't ordinarily be, but, there's a general trend that if things aren't going well, for your group in the country, there tends to be an increase in the number of people who get politically, disaffected. So I wonder if this is sort of a shrinking number they're going after.
Well, you raise a lot of issues that cut in different directions. I mean, there is a point of view that what we think of as sort of the cultural right, the Christian right, is declining in influence in the Republican Party. It is actually shrinking in size for a whole lot of different reasons. But I don't think there's a whole lot of sign that conservative discouragement with Bush or with the Republican Party at this point is affecting participation rates. And one of the dogs that didn't bark in the midterm elections of 2006, there's a lot of expectation that Republican turnout was going to be down sharply.
And it was.
That might have been the case in the Northeast, but not really anywhere else in the country. But, all the evidence I've seen, the Republican base turned out just as strongly as the Democratic base did. And furthermore, if you talk to conservatives to an astonishing extent, both conservative activists and opinion leaders have bought into the idea that Bush's troubles result from lack of fidelity to the conservative cause. In other words, that they lost in 2006 not because they didn't move to the center, but because they didn't move to the right.
But the problem there is it depends on how you define moving to the right. I mean, for example, fiscal conservatives can justly say that this guy ain't a conservative president. I mean, yes, he cut taxes, but generally fiscal conservatives want to cut taxes and cut spending, and he has never done that. So, fiscal conservatives can make that argument. And I'm not sure how cultural conservatives can make the claim that this guy isn't a conservative president.
Well, in some respects, all they really have to do is to point out that despite decades of rhetorical gestures, the Republican Party hasn't really delivered on its big demands of finding a way to outlaw abortion and essentially waging from the Oval Office a culture war. I think the real test of this hypothesis that many have that the cultural conservative part of the Republican Party is declining in influence, or even that the so-called war on terror is now sort of done for Republican unity what the Cold War used to do, and it provides the main glue to the Republican coalition. The real test of that is going to be, I think, the candidacy of Rudy Giuliani, who, by any conventional measure, has consistently taken positions, particularly on abortion, on gay rights, and in the past even on immigration,
right,
that are absolutely abhorrent to the cultural right.
Not to mention dressing up in drag.
Yeah, dressing up in drag. There are a lot of things.
Yeah.
But, I mean, frankly, if Rudy Giuliani is the Republican presidential nominee, it will fundamentally challenge a lot of assumptions that most people have had about the nature of the Republican coalition in a very, very fundamental way. But I'm not quite sure it's going to happen.
Well, there was actually a Times story today about how McCain's drop in the ratings has dramatically affected how the other sort of contenders, Romney, Giuliani, and Thompson, are waging the campaign. And the argument was that Giuliani seems to feel that there's hope, at least, that if Romney and Thompson both try to sort of go for the conservatives, then that allows Giuliani to sort of sweep in because he'll be the uncontested moderate candidate.
Well, yeah, but everything in politics is fluid.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how long. I think, frankly, big elements of the right wing of the Republican Party are trying to make up their minds between Romney and Thompson right now. Thompson hasn't even announced yet.
Yeah.
There are a lot of doubts about his just ability to be an effective candidate. There are a lot of questions about whether he's going to start too late to be able to compete in Iowa. But you know,
well, but he's organizing now. I mean, he's not a declared candidate, and there are limits to what he can do. But you know, his name is going to be. You know, I don't think he's basically.
He's already running second in a lot of the polls.
Yeah, exactly.
And without doing a thing really, other than make a few speeches.
Right.
But
well, there's all those Law and Order reruns.
Don't
underestimate
remains
those.
That whether or not they can agree on a candidate, a lot of the leadership, the cultural right. I mean, not only are they terrified of a Giuliani presidency because what it would represent in terms of the of actual public policy, you know, it would be the symbolic death of their wing of the Republican Party and their power to influence it if a guy like Rudy Giuliani actually got the nomination. Just earlier this week, there was a kind of interesting sign of, I think, things to come. When Mike Gerson, who's a columnist now for the Washington Post, did what I can only describe as a kneecapping of Rudy Giuliani, comparing him to Richard Nixon.
Gerson being the former Bush speechwriter.
And the basic thesis was that, like Nixon, Giuliani is this kind of cynical opportunist who seduces conservatives to support him by his combative attacks on their enemies, but actually doesn't have a principled or ideological bone in his body and can't be trusted, and will lead the Republican Party to electoral disaster, just like Nixon did through Watergate. Now, Mike Gerson is actually a pretty big deal in Washington. A lot of people remember him as the speechwriter who did the astounding job of actually making George W. Bush sound eloquent now and then.
No, he's written. I mean, I think he's one of the best speechwriters we've seen. I mean, I still think the second inaugural. You can disagree with the content, but it's a beautifully written speech.
Well, but beyond that, Gerson has been a major leadership figure among evangelical conservatives in Washington for many, many years. Mm-hmm. And so I personally, without getting into conspiracy theories, I do think this kind of treatment of Giuliani by him, this kind of treatment that would make it very difficult for a guy like Gerson to support him even as the nominee, we're going to start seeing a lot more of. And as you probably know, there have been a lot of polls out there showing that to an astounding degree, big percentages of Republican voters don't know anything about Giuliani's positions on cultural issues. And when they find out about them, they're less likely to support him. And even though he's bumping along in the 20s in most of the national polls, all it would really take is for one true conservative alternative to emerge, say after Iowa or New Hampshire, and suddenly those numbers don't look very good anymore. It's sort of a reflection of Hillary Clinton's problem in that even though her poll standing is much higher on the Democratic side, if all the anti-Clinton sentiment of the party coalesces behind one candidate, then it's a whole new ballgame.
Right. I don't know. I mean, Giuliani's sort of, sustained strength is actually, I agree with you, has somewhat mystified me because it's, again, sort of contrary to how you normally think of how frontrunners emerge from the GOP. And that you're right. I mean, he's adopted, at least on cultural issues, a whole range of positions that would be anathema to much of the conservative wing. I think 2008 is going to be a very interesting test case for how the GOP is responding to sort of declining poll ratings. I mean, there's two ways you can go with this. There's the Goldwater example, which says, if you're not doing well, at least run someone who's ideologically pure, as it were, as a way to sort of revitalize the Republican Party. And that even if you lose in 2008, at least you know what you stand for, and you can lay down the marker for 2012. There's the other example, though, and I think this is what the Democrats did in 2004 with nominating John Kerry, which was, Howard Dean was thought to be the front runner for a while, representing the sort of full-throated, populist voice of the Democratic Party. But in the end, I think a lot of Democrats said, well, wait, we want to win, and we're not sure we can win with Howard Dean. John Kerry is the grown-up, quote-unquote, which was a spectacularly wrong decision, but whatever.